For more on this story, let's cross to McDonald Lewanika, researcher at the London School of Economics, and who was a coordinator for grassroots activist groups in Zimbabwe for promoting democracy. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with Mugabe. It seems as polarizing in death as he was in life, what with this spat over where to bury him.
Yeah, a lot of people have been trying to oversimplify Mugabe's life, but the reality is exactly as you put it. Mugabe was a complex figure who has been as polarizing in death as he has been in life. Which is really interesting and disturbing at the same time, because one would have thought after being deposed from power in 2017, Mugabe would cease to be a factor. But the reality is that people are still struggling over his legacy, people are still struggling over what his history was, what his achievements were, and now people are struggling over his body and his burial site. So clearly as polarizing in life, indeed, as he has been in death.
And the family getting the last word.
Well, it seems, I don't know if the family has got the last word. Clearly, they have had, they are on their ascendancy at the moment, and they have declared that Mugabe will be buried privately in his rural home in Zimba. But we still have a couple of more days left, and a lot can unfold. They say a day is a long time in politics, and that statement is true even in this situation, because there are other people who matter and who may be able to play a more decisive and definitive role than the government of Zimbabwe with regards to where Mugabe is finally buried. I have in mind here long-time allies and friends of Mugabe like Kenneth Kaunda. I have in mind people like former South African President Thabo Mbeki and other heads of states. I think they can choose to side with the family and say we understand that, but the reality is that these people who also have might have a say and indeed a definitive say in terms of where Mugabe finally gets laid to rest. Of course, the family is talking about a private burial, but the reality is that Mugabe stopped being a private citizen a long time ago, and it is unfair for the family to claim him as a private entity at this particular point in time. Of course, there may be reasons for doing that, which we can always discuss.
Even though he jibed at the last election when he'd been thrown out of office, that he was casting a ballot for the opposition MDC.
Yeah. So Mugabe was like that, but after that election in which he cast a ballot for the MDC, he still came out and said that Chamisa must not complain; he must accept the results. So no one really knows where he finally stood politically. It would seem as if after that election, some kind of an arrangement or a detente had been reached with the Mnangagwa regime, which forced him not to side with Chamisa in terms of his claims around vote rigging. But again, that's part of the story of Mugabe, the enigma. You never really can be able to tell where he actually stood. We know that he had fallen out with Mnangagwa, but we don't know for certain that he had made his bed with the opposition.
McDonald Lewanika, you mentioned just how complex a figure he was. The fact that this lying in state happened at the Rufaro Stadium, which all Zimbabweans remember as the venue back in 1980, where they lit the flame of independence, hoisted the flag. There was a concert with Bob Marley. It shows that there were really several Robert Mugabes.
Yeah, and indeed, there were several Robert Mugabes. There was Robert Mugabe, the individual who was born and raised by Bona Mugabe in Zimba. There was Robert Mugabe, the revolutionary, who played a key role in the emancipation of the people of Zimbabwe from colonialism. Then Robert Mugabe, the prime minister, Robert Mugabe, the president. Indeed, there are many facets, and at these different stages in his life, Mugabe did certain things, some right and some wrong. But as others have pointed out, it is important for us not to whitewash the bad things that he did, despite the gallant entry into Rufaro Stadium in 1980 that you referred to. Mugabe did a lot of bad things, the Gukurahundi massacres, the mismanagement of the economy, and stuff like that. But simply because he did that, we also should not deny him the historical facts that he was a key member of the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, and that to some Zimbabweans he was a champion for economic emancipation, not to mention an inspiration to a lot of people on the African continent, which is why he's being respected and being mourned on the continent.
McDonald Lewanika, what about for you personally? It's been nearly a week now since we had the news that he died in that Singapore hospital. You've probably been reflecting during that time on what Robert Mugabe meant for you personally.
Yeah, and like everyone else, I've been struggling with how to view Robert Mugabe and his legacy, even from a personal perspective, because as an individual, all my adult life, I spent it fighting the Robert Mugabe regime. I joined the struggle for democratization and freedoms in Zimbabwe in 1999 when I was only 19, and I served as the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition Director up until 2014 before I came to London to pursue my doctoral studies. So all my adult life I fought Robert Mugabe, but even as someone who was fighting against Robert Mugabe, who was a victim of Robert Mugabe's regime through arrests, expulsions and bans from engaging in tertiary education in Zimbabwe, I find myself in a position where, to a very, very large extent, with his passing away last Friday, I feel I think nothing would be the correct word, because in my mind, Robert Mugabe is a person that I let go and forgave in 2017 after he was deposed. He no longer had power. Whatever he had done that was wrong, he was not being held accountable for it, and there was no chance that he was going to be held accountable. So he's not someone who in death has been able to impact me emotionally as he would have if he had continued to stay in power. And I think at an individual level, that is the space where I'm able to look at him objectively and say, yes, this was my tormentor, but yes, this person also has a mixed legacy and is understood in different ways by different people. So I'm basically wearing my intellectual and academic hat in terms of looking at Robert Mugabe rather than my personal head, which would be filled with emotions and probably force me to judge him much, much more harshly than I am articulating in this interview.
Well, one final question. Will his passing have an impact on current politics in Zimbabwe, or the current standoff between his old party, ZANU-PF, the military, and the opposition remain the same?
Well, I think that it would be wrong for us to think that Robert Mugabe's passing will not have an impact. It will have an impact. And clearly, if you look at some of the disagreements around what should take place and who should speak at his official ceremony, it shows you that there is a stake that is at play. The opposition wants to be involved. The ruling party wants to have the leading role. If you look at the disputes around where he's supposed to be buried, there are a lot of factors that are at play. There are personal security factors, perhaps a search for guarantees for Mugabe's family and close allies. There are political calculations. If you listen to some of the people who left with Robert Mugabe in 2017, people like Seveka Sukuere, Jonathan Moyo, you can tell that there is more to this than just a funeral, and there is more to this than just a dispute over where the remains of Robert Mugabe should be buried. So I'm fairly certain that behind the scenes, fortunately or unfortunately, there's a lot of haggling that is taking place with Robert Mugabe as the bargaining chip. So clearly, this funeral and what happens will have an impact and be decisive in respect of what happens next in Zimbabwean politics. We might see a rapprochement within ZANU-PF where the G40 might be accommodated, or at least it seems that is what they are bargaining for, some kind of amnesty, some kind of guarantees around their security, because they no longer have allies in government. We might see some guarantees being given to the wife around her own security, because that is also no longer guaranteed. Mugabe was a shield in life to his family. And now that he is gone, they need to seek other reassurances. And I think that part of that is what is at play in terms of what is happening, where concerns around where he will be buried are concerned. So clearly this funeral and the burial of Robert Mugabe will have an impact.
Yeah, and you mentioned Grace Mugabe. What lies in the future for her? You say that she might be part of the bargain here.
Yeah, perhaps one of the reasons that indeed motivates why the family is insisting that Robert Mugabe must not be taken to the Heroes Acre is a certain amount of certainty that Grace Mugabe will not be buried there with him. Whereas in Zimba, in his rural home, there is a possibility that she might. So that's one factor. But like I mentioned, Grace Mugabe no longer has allies in the state, and at the end of the day, the last and final bargaining chip that she has over the Mnangagwa regime is basically what happens to the remains of her husband at this particular point in time. This is the biggest and only chip that she's holding, and if she can be able to use it to extract guarantees for herself and for her children, I'm sure she will. She might not do it herself, she might have others do it for her, but that is clearly a key and critical question. There are guarantees that will be sought, I'm certain, because they no longer have allies in the state and cannot rely on just trust and trust alone.
McDonald Lewanika saying that, well, where and when he's buried, still very much up in the air. Thank you for speaking with us from London.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.